confusing things, margin and padding, which are almost used in everywhere while using CSS. Margins and padding are the two most commonly used properties. These are the properties for spacing out elements. The margin is the space outside the element, whereas the padding is the space inside the element. While most style rules can be applied to most block level and inline elements, some can only be applied to block level elements. Those are border, margin and padding. In most cases, you'll only apply the text positioning styles to box level elements. Moving on, here is the most wonderful and interesting example of CSS box model. In CSS box model, you are seeing margins, borders, paddings, and content. What is content? Content is the content of a box where text images can appear. And padding clears an area around the content. The padding is transparent. Border, a border that gives around the padding and content. And margin is also a transparent like padding, and it clears an area outside the border. Okay, padding clears the area around the content, while the margin clears the area outside the border. Just key. And here is a wonderful example of CSS box model. Here the box model allows us to add a border around the element and to define space between the elements. Moving on further, we see another example of CSS box model. Like here, the paragraph we saw is a margin left property is 10 pixels, margin right property 20 pixels. Margin left property means it will be marginalized from left towards the right 10 pixels, and margin right means it will be marginalized towards left from the right 20 pixels. Padding, as we discussed, padding is the space inside the elements. Padding is 10 pixels. So moving on, these are some references where you can find out the HTML or CSS codes, and you can test on online editors as you want. Moving on, difference between ID and classes. What is an ID selector? An ID selector is used to specify a style for a single or unique element. The ID selector uses the ID attribute of the HTML element. It is defined with a hash. There are two main types of selectors. One is class selector and the second is ID selector. The functionality of both is same, only the difference is the difference of declaration. ID selectors is declared with a hash, and the class selector is declared with dot. This is the one and only difference between ID selector and the class selector, while the functionality of both is 100% same, not a single difference. Here you can see an example of ID selector. It starts with the hash. Para 1, it is the our class, and inside the class we have the values and the properties. Moving on is the example. We give paragraphs, both paragraphs IDs. First paragraph we gave ID example ID1 and second ID2, and in ID1 we know we background color white, and ID2 we background color blue. So on the right side on the web page you can see the difference while assigning the ID and in progress of the work. Moving on is the another code example. And now the class selector, as we discussed, the only difference of class between class selector and the ID selector is over the difference of declaration, and which is hash or dot. Moving on is another code examples. Now we can declare multiple classes. It is possible to include multiple classes at the same time. For example, assuming we have the following CSS declaration, like first we have a class I apply large, and we have the properties and values. We have the property font size and the value 20 pixels, and the second class we have apply red, and the property is color, and the value is this, and the following changes would be happening to our code. Moving on, here are some CSS properties. Firstly, we discuss the border